Europe, circa 1970. Elliot Sperling has just finished his second year at Queen's College and is still uncertain of what to study. He's looking for inspiration by hitchhiking across the continent, taking a cue from one of his Beat Generation heroes, Jack Kerouac, and the book, On the Road. Arriving in Athens at the end of his trip, Elliot meets a fellow traveler with a suggestion. "You know, the road doesn't end in Greece," says the other hitchhiker. "You can go on to Turkey, Asia, India." Elliot is intrigued, but out of money. Returning to New York, he takes a job as a taxi driver to save up enough cash for his next adventure. With his eyes now set on the road through Asia, Elliot has just placed himself on the path to a lifetime of distinguished scholarship and advocacy. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a MacArthur Fellow and his groundbreaking research into the history of Tibet. It's the late 1960s in America, and a generation of students is caught up in the counterculture of the era. It's a hodgepodge of Maoists, Hare Krishna devotees, LSD enthusiasts, and everything in between. But connecting them all is the belief that big changes are needed in the world, and that solutions are more likely to be found outside of traditional Western values. Young Elliot Sperling, galvanized by his opposition to the Vietnam War, is also looking for answers. Born in the Bronx in 1951 to a secular Jewish family, Elliot never practiced religious customs at home, but he sees some promise in the philosophies and religions of Asia. With his hard-earned taxi fares in hand, Elliot returns to Athens and heads east, eager to learn more.
जिंदगी एक सफर है सुहाना यहाँ कल क्या हो किसने जाना जिंदगी.
Elliot's road trip brings him through Istanbul, Kabul, Lahore, and finally to New Delhi in India, where radios and jukeboxes all over are playing the music from the recent Bollywood hit Andaz. The sounds and bustle of the city are exhilarating, but another American backpacker on his way back home points Elliot in a different direction. Tibet House. A quiet refuge from the city, Tibet House in New Delhi was a cultural center founded in 1965 to protect and preserve the traditions of the Tibetan diaspora. It was Elliot's first exposure to the culture of Tibet, and he began to focus his attention onto this unique group of people. From New Delhi, Elliot continued on to Kathmandu in Nepal, where he spent time with a much larger Tibetan community, and finally to Dharamshala, the Indian town and home to the Tibetan government in exile. Like many of his generation, Elliot was initially drawn to Tibetan Buddhism in pursuit of some higher knowledge or spiritual awakening that had eluded him in the West. But as he immersed himself more fully among the Tibetan people, he found his priorities shifting.
My interest in Tibet, and this is it's a very funny thing, I dabbled in things that dealt with Tibetan Buddhism, with Buddhism in general, and the more I got to know Tibetans as individuals, the more I became less interested in Tibetan Buddhism. This is going to be a paradoxical, and more interested in Tibetans as people and what their history was. The history seemed like this big, vast unknown to me at that time, and I just loved exploring it.
Now intent on learning about the history of Tibet and its place in the world, Elliot returned from abroad to Queen's College and finally decided on a major, East Asian Studies. In 1973, Elliot graduated from Queen's College and soon after enrolled in a master's program at Indiana University. Indiana University was one of only 2 schools in the country where one could focus on Tibetan history, and among Elliot's teachers was Tatse Rinpoche, the oldest brother of the 14th and current Dalai Lama. Now equipped with years of study and an ability to read both Chinese and Tibetan, Elliot returned once more to India to work on his dissertation, an inquiry into Tibetan-Chinese relations during the Ming Dynasty. Of central importance to the modern Tibetan diaspora has been the question of Tibetan sovereignty. In 1950, after the Chinese Civil War ended in victory for the Communist Party, Chinese forces invaded Tibet and took control of the territory under the 17-point agreement. 9 years later, amidst renewed fighting in the region, the Dalai Lama fled to India and established a Tibetan government in exile, beginning a debate over Tibet's status that continues to this day. The Chinese government's official position is that Tibet has been governed by China since at least the Yuan dynasty, a Mongolian regime that ruled China in the 13th and 14th centuries. Following the Yuan dynasty was the Ming dynasty, a native Chinese regime, and finally the Qing dynasty, a Manchurian regime that conquered and ruled China from the 1600s to the 20th century. Western scholars did not dispute that both the Yuan and Qing dynasties held power over Tibet, but Tibet's relationship to the Ming dynasty remained a question that Elliot sought to answer. For his research, Elliot delved extensively into both Chinese and Tibetan language sources. He considered Chinese sources to be essential, calling them the great historians of Asia. But Elliot was among the first international historians to also use Tibetan sources extensively, where other scholars, even in the West, had previously relied on Chinese sources alone. With this full picture of both sides of the Tibetan-Chinese relationship during the Ming Dynasty, Elliot came to a provocative conclusion, namely, that there was very little relationship at all. He found that while the Ming Dynasty ruled in China, Tibet was internally divided among competing local regimes. The interactions between China and Tibet were limited to largely superficial diplomatic and religious affairs and did not include any kind of Chinese control over Tibetan territory. Elliot's dissertation, for which he earned his PhD in 1983, was considered a landmark in the study of Tibetan-Chinese relations, and it was largely on the strength of this work that he was awarded the MacArthur Fellowship just 1 year later at the young age of 33. Elliot's continued research and analysis placed him squarely into the fraught conflict between the Chinese government and the Tibetan independence movement. He took the position that Tibet constituted a society historically distinct from China, and that their relationship before the 20th century was largely the result of mutual conquest by outside invaders, rather than any inherent national connection. But while these conclusions stood in stark contrast to the Chinese position, Elliot maintained his independence from the Tibetan establishment as well. He criticized the Tibetan government in exile for failing to acknowledge the historical domination of Tibet by the Mongol and Manchu empires. And among his peers in the West, Elliot was also critical of Tibetophiles, those who continued to romanticize Tibet and view it as a pinnacle of spirituality and enlightenment. It was this youthful passion for resisting the status quo that provided his work with the kind of integrity essential for any great historian. And through all the controversy, Elliot never lost sight of the joy that comes from uncovering the past.
There's a great sense of fulfillment that you get having gone through all of the training that you do in terms of language. To be able to sit down and read something that's 500, 600 years old, there's just a visceral sense of pleasure that you get from it. Tibetan studies, there's still so much to be done. There are other fields in which if I had been involved in them, I could see myself just, agonizing over what am I going to do for a dissertation, what am I going to do for a thesis. In Tibetan studies, there is so much that remains to be done.
Elliot Sperling retired in 2015 and relocated to Jackson Heights, home to the largest Tibetan community in America. Here he became a part of a close-knit community of Tibetan activists, artists, and scholars, and continued his advocacy for an honest inquiry into Tibet's history. Sadly, this promising third act was cut short when Elliot died suddenly at the age of 66. But it's an act that's been picked up by his former students and others around the world, for whom Elliot threw open the doors to Tibet's unique past, doors that won't easily be shut again.